November 13th, 2025. Florida State Prison in Stark. A 66-year-old man sits in a cell, watching the clock. He knows exactly how many hours he has left. He knows the precise moment his heart will stop beating. Most of us go through life wondering when our time will come. Brian Jennings didn't have that uncertainty. At 6:20 p.m. his life would end, not by accident, not by illness, but by the state of Florida. This wasn't a sudden decision. Jennings had been on death row for 46 years, longer than many of us have been alive. Nearly 5 decades of waiting, appealing, hoping for a different outcome. But on this particular Wednesday, all the appeals had run out, all the legal options exhausted. The state of Florida had set the time and nothing was going to stop it. What goes through someone's mind in those final 24 hours? When the clock is no longer your friend, but your enemy? When every passing second brings you closer to a moment you can't escape? Today, we're taking you inside those last hours. The protocol, the rituals, the humanity, and the horror of death row's final countdown. Before we continue, I want to talk about something important. Cases like this force us to ask difficult questions, not just about justice, but about protection. How do these things happen? What warning signs did people miss? How can we keep ourselves and our families safer? That's exactly why I created my ebook, 25 Ways Criminals Think and How to Outsmart Them. This guide breaks down the psychology behind criminal behavior, the thought patterns, the warning signs, and most importantly, the practical steps you can take to recognize danger before it's too late. It's about empowerment, not fear. You'll find the link in the description below. Now, let's get back to Brian Jennings. To understand why Brian Jennings spent his final hours in a death row cell, we need to go back 46 years, to May 11th, 1979. Jennings was 20 years old at the time, a Marine on leave, staying with his aunt in Brevard County, Florida. On that early morning, he broke into the home of the Kunash family. He crept through an unlocked window and entered the bedroom of 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash, who was sleeping. He abducted her, forced her into his car, and drove to a canal on Merritt Island. What happened next is almost unbearable to describe. Jennings sexually assaulted the child. He then lifted her upside down by her feet and slammed her head onto the ground with such force that her skull fractured. Finally, he held her head underwater in the canal for 10 minutes until she drowned. Her small body was discovered in the canal later that same day. Jennings was arrested just hours later on an unrelated traffic warrant, but detectives quickly connected him to Rebecca's disappearance. His fingerprints were on Rebecca's bedroom windowsill. His shoe prints were found outside her window. When he returned to his aunt's house, his clothes and hair were soaking wet. Though he initially denied everything, Jennings eventually confessed. In 1980, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and sexual battery. They recommended death by an 11-1 vote, and the judge sentenced him accordingly. But that wasn't the end of the legal battle. The Florida Supreme Court overturned that first conviction due to a conflict of interest with his defense attorney. In 1982, he was retried, convicted again, sentenced to death again. That conviction was also overturned on appeal. Finally, in 1986, a third trial took place in Bay County to avoid publicity. Once again, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and sexual battery. Once again, they recommended death, this time by an 11-1 vote. This time, the conviction stuck. From 1986 to 2025, Jennings filed appeal after appeal. Every single one was denied. 46 years passed between his crime and his execution. That raises a question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. Is 46 years of legal appeals justice delayed? Or is it the system working as intended? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Brian Jennings spent 46 years on death row at Florida State Prison in Stark, a facility that houses Florida's only execution chamber. For most of those decades, his world shrank to a 6 by 9 foot cell. He spent up to 23 hours a day in isolation, 3 hours per week of outdoor recreation if he was lucky. The rest of his time? Alone with his thoughts, his appeals, and the knowledge that the state wanted him dead. The psychological toll of this existence is crushing. Decades of waiting, watching other inmates walk the final corridor while you remain. Some prisoners on death row have dropped their appeals voluntarily, choosing execution over continuing to live under these conditions. One inmate told a fellow prisoner before his execution that he'd rather die than keep existing in such isolation. But here's something most people don't know, a detail that might surprise you. Until 2022, Florida's death row inmates lived under some of the harshest conditions in the nation: permanent solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in their cells. But in April 2022, just 3 years before Jennings' execution, Florida settled a lawsuit that changed everything. Death row inmates were suddenly allowed up to 20 hours per week in day rooms with other prisoners, access to phones, television, and 6 hours of outdoor recreation weekly instead of 3. After 39 years of near-total isolation, Jennings spent his final 3 years with slightly more human contact. He could talk to other inmates, make phone calls, watch television. It wasn't freedom, not even close, but it was more than he'd had for 4 decades. Still, nothing changed the fundamental reality. He was waiting to die. On November 13, 2025, that wait finally ended. November 12, 2025. 6 RPM, exactly 24 hours before his scheduled execution. Brian Jennings would have been moved from his regular cell to the death watch area, a cell adjacent to the execution chamber. Before the transfer, guards would have strip-searched him, checking for weapons or anything he could use to harm himself. Prison officials don't want inmates taking their own lives. The state has a schedule to keep. From this moment forward, Jennings would be under constant surveillance. Guards would watch him every second, monitoring his every movement to ensure he survived long enough for the state to kill him. Think about that for a moment. Most of us don't know when we'll die. We live with the comfortable illusion that we have time. Tomorrow, next week, next year. Jennings didn't have that luxury. He knew down to the minute when his life would end. During these final 24 hours, he would have been allowed visits from family, friends, attorneys, and spiritual advisors. These meetings would take place through barriers, no physical contact, just words across glass or metal screens. What do you say to someone you love when you know it's the last conversation you'll ever have? How do you compress a lifetime of feelings into a few hours? At 8 a.m. on November 13th, all visitors would have been prohibited. From that point forward, the only people Jennings would interact with were guards and the prison chaplain. The equipment in the execution chamber would be tested, straps checked, phone lines verified, everything prepared. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a final check for any last-minute legal intervention or governor's reprieve would be underway. In rare cases, executions have been halted just hours before they're scheduled to occur. But for Jennings, no reprieve came. By late afternoon on November 13th, everything would be ready. The execution team would assemble, usually prison officials and medical personnel. Witnesses would begin arriving, representatives from the victim's family, media witnesses, and perhaps someone representing Jennings. The clock kept ticking towards 6 p.m. This brings up one of the most contentious debates in our justice system. Where do you stand on the death penalty? Does it provide justice and closure, or does it perpetuate violence? I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the hours leading up to his execution, Jennings would have been allowed final visits. Public records don't specify exactly who came to see him during those last hours, whether family members made the journey, whether attorneys stopped by, or if a spiritual advisor offered comfort. What we do know is how these visits typically unfold on death row. Visitors sit separated from the condemned by barriers, plexiglass or metal screens that prevent any physical contact. No hugs, no holding hands, just voices and faces, inches apart yet impossibly far away. Florida's death row protocol allows condemned inmates to receive visits from immediate family, attorneys, and spiritual advisors during their final hours. On the day of execution, one final contact visit may be permitted, a chance to actually touch a loved one's hand, feel a hug one last time. For inmates who spend decades in isolation, that simple physical contact becomes profoundly meaningful. What do you say in those moments? Some inmates apologize, seeking forgiveness they know may never come. Others simply tell their families they love them. Florida's execution protocol specifies that on the day of execution, the condemned inmate may receive 1-hour-long contact visit. After years of barriers and distance, families can embrace one final time. For parents, siblings, or children saying goodbye to someone they love, despite what that person has done, the emotional weight is staggering. Spiritual advisors also play a crucial role during these final hours. In recent years, courts have affirmed the right of condemned inmates to have their chosen spiritual advisor present, even in the execution chamber itself. For the families of those on death row, the emotional toll is devastating. Studies show that family members experience depression, anxiety, and PTSD from having a loved one facing execution. They live in a state of anticipatory grief, knowing their loved one will die, but not knowing exactly when. They face stigma, isolation, and guilt by association. Whether Jennings' family visited him in those final hours remains unknown. But one thing is certain: the clock kept moving toward 6 p.m. One of the most haunting traditions of death row is the last meal. In Florida, condemned inmates are served breakfast at 6 a.m. on the day of their execution. Around 9 or 10 a.m., they receive their requested last meal. Florida's rules are specific. The meal must cost no more than $40, be purchased locally, and be prepared at the prison. No fast food is allowed, no alcohol either, though that wasn't always the case. There's no public record of what Brian Jennings requested for his last meal. Some inmates choose comfort food from childhood: fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, ice cream. Others opt for seafood or steak. A few refuse to eat altogether, like Ted Bundy, who was given Florida's standard meal: steak, eggs, toast, and hash browns, but touched none of it. The symbolism is heavy. It's a moment of humanity before the state takes a life. Beyond food, inmates can make other final requests. They can request visits from specific people. They can ask for a spiritual advisor to be present during the execution itself. They can prepare final written or verbal statements. What they cannot do is stop the clock. By early afternoon on November 13th, the execution chamber would be prepped, the witnesses assembling, and Brian Jennings would be given his final shower and dressed in his execution garments. As the afternoon wore on, the execution chamber at Florida State Prison was prepared. This small room houses a gurney where the condemned inmate will be strapped down. Medical personnel would test the intravenous lines. Florida Department of Law Enforcement agents would verify the lethal chemicals, a 3-drug protocol designed to end life. First drug, etomidate, a sedative meant to render the person unconscious. Second, rocuronium bromide, a paralytic that stops breathing. Third, potassium acetate, which stops the heart. Meanwhile, witnesses began gathering. Florida law requires specific people to be present: representatives from the victim's family if they choose to attend, media witnesses selected by lottery, prison officials and law enforcement, and potentially someone representing the condemned. Outside the prison, two groups assembled on the lawn. Members of Our Lady of Lourdes Church from Daytona Beach arrived by bus, carrying signs opposing the death penalty. Across from them, death penalty supporters waited. One man, Bill Campbell, held his signature bye-bye sign listing the names of recently executed inmates. Inside, at approximately 5:30 p.m., Brian Jennings would have been escorted from his cell to the execution chamber. Guards would have accompanied him every step. He would be strapped to the gurney, across his chest, arms, and legs, ensuring he couldn't move. Medical personnel would insert IV lines into both arms as backups in case one failed. The witnesses would file into their designated viewing room, separated from the execution chamber by a window. Everything was ready. At 6 p.m., the warden would give the signal. A phone line to the governor's office remained open until the last moment, in case of a last-minute stay. None came. The execution team, positioned in an adjacent room hidden from view, would begin administering the drugs through the IV lines. First, etomidate, the sedative. The warden would assess whether Jennings was unconscious. If so, the paralytic rocuronium bromide would follow. Finally, potassium acetate to stop his heart. A physician would monitor his cardiac activity throughout. If you're finding this deep examination of the justice system compelling, please subscribe to True Crime Nook. We bring you stories that go beyond the headlines, exploring the human reality behind every case. The warden asked Brian Jennings if he had any last words. This is the final opportunity for a condemned person to speak, to apologize, to proclaim innocence, to say goodbye, to pray, or simply to acknowledge the moment. Jennings looked at the warden. "No," he said. That single word was all he offered. No apology to Rebecca Kunash's family, no final statement, just no. The warden gave the signal. In an adjacent room, hidden from the witness's view, the execution team began administering the 3-drug protocol. The etomidate flowed through the IV line. Within moments, Jennings would have lost consciousness. The paralytic followed, stopping his ability to breathe. Finally, potassium acetate stopped his heart. The witnesses watched through the glass. Some wiped away tears. Others remained stone-faced. At 6:20 p.m., a physician checked for cardiac activity and found none. Brian Frederick Jennings was pronounced dead. A heavy silence filled the chamber. Outside on the prison lawn, the anti-death penalty protesters bowed their heads in prayer. The death penalty supporters began to disperse. Inside, officials would prepare to release a brief statement. The body would be removed. The witnesses would be escorted out. Jennings became the 16th person executed in Florida in 2025. The most executions the state had carried out in any single year in its history. A grim record. 46 years after Rebecca Kunash's murder, the state's justice had been delivered. Rebecca Kunash's father waited decades for this moment, but he passed away in 2001, 24 years before Jennings' execution. He died never seeing justice carried out. Rebecca's mother moved out of state and continued waiting. Whether she attended the execution or chose to stay away remains unclear from public records. In 2013, a prosecutor who worked on the case described it as one of the worst murder cases he'd ever handled. He expressed frustration with the long wait and felt that Kunash's mother deserved closure. But what is closure really? Does watching someone die bring peace? Does it undo the trauma? Rebecca Kunash was 6 years old when she died. She would have been 52 at the time of Jennings' execution. She never got to finish first grade, never learned to ride a bike without training wheels, never went to prom, never graduated, never fell in love, never had children of her own. Those stolen years can't be returned. Time doesn't heal these wounds, it only changes them. Kunash's mother waited 46 years for this execution. Her father died waiting. Another parent, Johnny Martinez, whose son was also murdered, waited 18 years for his child's killer to be executed. He called the Kunash family's 46-year wait unbelievable. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis defended the record number of executions in 2025, stating, "Justice delayed is justice denied." But does execution provide the closure families seek? Studies show mixed results. Some families report feeling relief. Others say the execution changes nothing. Their loved one is still gone. Rebecca Kunash never got to grow up. That remains the tragedy at the heart of this story. No execution can change that fundamental truth. Here's a question worth reflecting on. Do you believe executions provide genuine closure for victims' families, or does true healing come from somewhere else entirely? This is a deeply personal topic. I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Rebecca Kunash's murder teaches us critical lessons about child safety that remain relevant today. Jennings entered through an unlocked window. That single point of entry changed everything. One of Becky's classmates said she still cannot sleep if there's an unlocked window in her home, 46 years later. Here's what parents need to know. Secure all windows and doors before bed, every single night. Install window locks on children's bedrooms. Consider window alarms that sound if opened. Teach children what to do if someone enters their room at night. They should scream immediately and fight back if possible. Noise is a criminal's enemy. Know who's in your neighborhood. Jennings had a prior criminal history. Pay attention when law enforcement alerts the community about concerning individuals. Consider installing motion sensor lights around your home's perimeter. Criminals prefer darkness and easy access. Make your home a harder target. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, act on that feeling. Call law enforcement if you notice suspicious activity in your neighborhood. These tragedies don't have to keep happening. Simple precautions, locked windows, security awareness, teaching children safety protocols can make the difference between life and death. Rebecca Kunash's story is heartbreaking, but if sharing it helps even one family protect their child, her memory serves a purpose beyond tragedy. Understanding criminal psychology isn't just academic, it's practical protection for you and your family. That's why I created 25 Ways Criminals Think and How to Outsmart Them. This guide goes beyond theory. It gives you actionable strategies to recognize danger, secure your home, protect your children, and make yourself a harder target. It's based on real criminal psychology research and actual cases. You'll learn how criminals select victims, what warning signs to watch for, and specific steps to keep your family safer. The link is in the description below. It's an investment in your family's safety. Thank you for watching this examination of Brian Jennings' final 24 hours. These stories matter, not for sensationalism, but for understanding, awareness, and prevention. If this video gave you something to think about, please hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more deep examinations of true crime cases that go beyond the headlines, subscribe to True Crime Nook and turn on notifications. Until next time, stay safe.